Hello and welcome to the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast, where we talk about anything and everything fantasy and science fiction. Your host is Matt Crosswhite, and the subject matter expert is Josiah Marshall. And here we go. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Christian Fantasy and Sci-Fi Podcast. I'm the host, Matt Crosswhite, joined by subject matter expert, Josiah Marshall. How are you, sir?
Howdy. Doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. We have a fun topic today. We're going to discuss how fantasy and sci-fi ages. So, Josiah, I have kind of three categories in my head. One is aging like a fine wine, which implies it gets better with time. I have aging like an overripe fruit, which does not get better with time in any sense. And category three is aging like McDonald's French fries, which doesn't age at all, no matter how old they get. So tell me, in your perspective, which category does fantasy and sci-fi fall into?
Oh my word! Oh my goodness. Okay, well, sorry. The description, the fact that you just threw in McDonald's fries in there, has completely obliterated the first two that you ever gave me. So let me just sit on that for a moment, because the irony of that is just so absolutely hysterical. Using McDonald's fries as a measurement standard, that's funny. That's really funny. Okay, so we were
Fine wine,
and overripe fruit and fries. Yeah, okay. Okay. Let me actually take note on all these. I think that if something was to age like a McDonald's French fry, it would get very old, and it would lose meaning. It would lose substance. It would lose purpose for any and every culture, society that ever associated with it. So I'm going to leave that one there along with the Twinkie. When it comes to fruit, it comes to mind is actually the parables out of the Bible, and specifically how Jesus was even talking to the fig tree. I mean, for crying out loud, we got Jesus talking to a tree. That's what we see the average guy, well, not the average, but still, that's what we see people do, say, walking down certain parts of Washington, D.C. or New York City. Talking to the lamppost. I actually was in Washington, D.C. one time, and this guy was shadow boxing at a tree. And then all of a sudden he throws up his fist and starts dancing like Rocky. I did it. And he starts walking past me and my friend when we were there visiting DC, and he sees me and he says, "You want to fight me, don't you?" No, I see what you did to the tree. You're good. Says, "Yeah, I did. I'll take you out too." And he starts walking off, shadow boxing the air and pumping himself up.
Oh my goodness.
For whatever his reasons may be, we've got Jesus talking to a tree. And specifically casting judgment upon those fruits. So I think that in some of that light, just looking at it through that lens, that certain stories, I think, do lose their flavor. They lose their taste. They lose their aromatic sense of desire, because it loses its position. It loses its interest in the people that have been working on it. I would almost equate it to a writer. They're trying to work on a story, and then all of a sudden, something about the story just tanks, and it just I don't want to do that, and then they shove it into a box or delete it, whatever the case may be. But the fine wine, okay, I like this. I like this a lot, because if we were to equate George McDonald having worked with grapes, what has come from those grapes is and it's not just one bouquet. It's not one bouquet of wine. It is it's a diverse bouquet of wine. Because if we were to even include a lot of secular authors, the distance, the spectrum of approach to fantasy and science fiction and various pieces of mythological characters or a mythological idea that has been expounded upon and looked at. Oh my word, there's just such a plethora. I'm reminded of this new word that I'm hearing going around called neurodivergent.
Mm.
When it comes to mental health of an individual. Well, I would say that the fantasy and science fiction has their own neurodivergency going on there in just the various ways that it has spanned out and almost. All right, I'll get a little on the nose here. I'm a lot like the tree that we see in Norse mythology. That's definitely highlighted in the Thor movies that the Marvel movies that were put out, and how
Mhm.
those trees end up being very specific, have very specific purposes, and the way they stretch out and have very varied significance for the universe. But not to get too philosophical here, but I'm going to say number one. Long answer. Number one.
Okay, so let me clarify. Number one being the fine wine.
The
Does
fine
that
wine.
is that a generalization of most fantasy books, radio dramas, movies, etc.? Most sci-fi of the same uh, fall into that category, but I'm sure there's certainly some that are in the other two categories. Or is it more, can't really think of an exception? They all pretty much get better with age.
It's general to some degree. But there is some specifics that I would point out. For example, dwarves.
Hmm.
When we look back at George McDonald, dwarves have a very spiritual significance. Now, when you look back into folklore, I'm not going to get too lectury here, but I'm just going to touch on some little key aspects of dwarf folklore. So, the idea of what a dwarf is has definitely changed through not only cultural lens, but even just through time. But also with the accessibility of being able to read someone else's story and then expound upon it. Because let's face it, for a long time there, folklore was very specific to a given region. It didn't really expand out from there, although you could go into one area and then another area and see some similarities. Okay, well, a creature here is being called a dwarf. A creature over here is being called a pixie. Okay. And they could almost see some direct tie-ins about how these two similarities work. But it's not just pixies. One thing that we would see very distinct these days was dwarf and elves back in the day.
Mhm.
There was a lot of overlapping similarities between dwarfs and elves. So
Interesting.
over time, we have come to what we would say is the Tolkien effect of this, where we've gotten more distinct features for each, more distinct purposes, and more distinct nuances, especially nuances that has enhanced the flavor this, of these two separate literary beings. And I would even suggest, just as a side note, can we simply say that they're literary beings? What about ideological? What about mythological? Um, are these creatures simply confined to books? I don't think
Mm.
so, because as we go back, still things were born out of, interestingly enough, just a little side point here, when it was considered that when somebody ate the food of a specific ground, they would end up being grounded in a way that when they would eat of that food, there was a spiritual connection between them and the land. And so as a result, they would then be able to start discerning things about that land that was specific to that area, such as in Scotland, pixies, such as in Germanic areas, dwarfs. So there was a lot that was really born down into what we were experiencing on another level, which is why dwarves, historically and folklorically speaking, have a position in the molding of dreams. There's an old, let's see, there's an old Germanic phrase, I can't remember what it was, but it basically equates dwarves to dark water. And water is symbolically meant, especially in a number of different cultures, chaos. And specifically with dwarves, there was this element, depending on the culture, of either nightmarish or darker dreams that were associated with the dwarves. And that if it was a more positive dream, that it might have been a more of an elvish dream than it was a dwarf. But that's again where the similarities really overlap between the dwarves and the elves. Okay. But again, what we've seen and learned is that folklore is not limited to its geography. It's not even limited to its time and space or history. It has superseded all of that. We can't even say that Matthew Dick. I know I've mentioned this before. Matthew Dickerson and David O'Hara's book about the history of fantasy. We see that it transposes time in a very supernatural way. And so if it's doing that, it's also transposing the idea that a certain group have all complete rights to it. So we can't say, well, Christians can only have lions and talking animals and witches and so forth. Or with George McDonald, we can't have everything he used and built with in his stories. This is going to be encompassing. Everybody is going to be able to look at this in different ways, which is why I would continue to reiterate the idea that this is a fine wine, because everybody's going to enhance the flavor. Everybody's going to enhance what the wine's doing and how it can be appreciated by multiple groups in multiple ways. So, and that's just fantasy. Now, when we look at science fiction, we go back to people like H.G. Wells, which really, and Jules Verne. Those two were the captains. Those were the grandpappies of really what we come to understand and love about science fiction. And really, it's kind of amazing to see the durability of their stories, and not just lasting as long as they have, but the continued influence that they've had. Whether it's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea on deep sea exploration, submarines, and so forth, or if it's H.G. Wells on space travel.
Mm-hmm.
When we get into World War II, now I know I've stressed on this before, but I'm going to bring it up this time because I really see World War I, but as one catalyst, but really World War II as being the bigger catalyst of what happens when it comes to folklore and how it's spread into this vineyard of just complex flavors and options. World War II became known as the War of the Book. Now, we can do that figuratively, but we can also do it literally. Literally speaking, Hitler and the Nazi regime actually took books in the thousands upon thousands of quantities and literally had book burning ceremonies, events in Berlin and in surrounding areas of just Germany itself. And the whole premise of the Nazi regime was that we are a superior form of being. They practiced eugenics, which was deciding how we were going to perfect the human body and have a desirable offspring, and so that we didn't have all these offsprings that had deformities or problems that we didn't understand or didn't want or considered to be deemed undignified. And so the same happened with the books. If there was a book that was written by an author that was considered an undesirable or an inferior being by the Nazi regime, then those books were burned in perpetuity, both literally and figuratively. The authors were denounced in more ways than one, and then their books were literally taken to stacks in just droves and mountains of books and just burned and burned and burned. And but yet, here's the tenacity that we see when it comes to imagination, folklore, and everything that ends up encompassing who we are and how we understand ourselves. Because folklore has helped us understand ourselves. We understand ourselves by the context in which we're in. Whether it's folklore, whether it's our geography, you're going to have a different understanding of yourself if you, say, grow up in mountains than if you would if you grew up on plains. And let's face it, you've got some of these stories that, well, I grew up on a space station and you grew up on a planet. What's some of the contrasting going on here? So, but the tenacity is this, and we see it really. Oh, Tolkien, what have you done to us? We see it really happening with Tolkien and Lewis, and there are others. There are other. Charles Williams, who was part of the Inklings, also was a casualty of World War II in the sense that he went through it just like everybody else. I don't know for certain if he actually served, so don't quote me there. But as a result, it still had an impact on how he was viewing the world and how he was able to use story to help him process that. Williams was far more supernatural in his approach. Tolkien was very historical in his approach. Lewis was very spiritual in his approach, more allegorical in his approach.
You sure?
There was a lot more realism to Tolkien than there was with the other two. And there was even more. I mean, it's not limited to these three guys when it comes to the Inklings. There was a whole lot more, but I'm not going to go into that for the sake of time. But for now, the World War II ended up becoming this major catalyst that not only gave people the ability to look at things happening and discern, contrast, and just be able to evaluate where they're at in this, but find that writing and story was an impressive and in very capable way of enabling them to do that in a way that other people were able to come along and say, I see it, I hear you, I know what you're talking about, and let me add to this and show you what I'm seeing as well. Now, one of the more historical bits of this being the Book of the War was that on the American side, there was a impressive movement. I would call it a movement of librarians who realized that World War II soldiers needed help mentally. There was gold bricking that we know of. They used to call it gold bricking. They were losing their minds because they were sitting for hours in these trenches. And the only thing that was on their minds was the constant fear of death and the constant bombardment that was just rattling their senses. And there were men that would literally lose their minds. And so an effort to help these GIs to maintain a sense of sanity to some degree, they knew books are going to be an avenue that they're going to use as a way of escaping that moment of, okay, here are all these bombs, here's all these bullets flying by me, where else could I go? But the hassle they ran into was that the printing process of the day relied more on what we now call hardback or hardcover.
Sure.
So these were very stiff bindings. Books were also much larger. There were smaller ones, don't get me wrong, but the ability to be able to compact an entire book, even into a smaller hardback book, was still going to be quite difficult, just due to how printing presses were made up. but really the binding process, because the binding process was the part that really took the time. It really took the majority of the time for a printer. So, make a long story short, librarians did a drive. They got hundreds of thousands of books, but they were all hardcover. And then they realized the logistics of even getting them to the soldiers was much harder. And it was limited to locations such as hospitals, bases, where they could set up a place for these books to have a space, and usually for either the GIs that were stationed behind the lines or there for recovering from injuries could have access to them. So they went to the Joint Chiefs and all the military heads and says, how can we get this directly into the hands of the average Joe sitting in that trench? And that's when they came up with the paperback. Now, this paperback was so condensed. Now, I'm not talking abridged. I'm talking condensed. They would take entire books and print them so that they would easily fit directly into the pocket of a GI's uniform.
Whoa.
Yeah. And so what they came up with was really quite simple, but yet, let me put it this way. What's known as an ASE, Armed Services Edition of a book, did not last very long because the paper was so thin, and the way they bound it was usually through some glue and then 2 staples. Okay. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking at a rectangle and you're having multiple pieces of rectangle pages stacked on top of each other, the left side of it was where the glue happened and all the staples happened, so that we could read it like an average English book, right?
Sure.
But because of the wear and tear and the fact that it was paper, my grandfather would pull out his and they were just nubs. It was just everything that was still being bound by the glue and the staples. All the pages were completely gone. Wow. Now, while I was a bookstore owner, I had the absolute privilege of finding a guy who was selling ASCs, and I have become the proud steward, I should say, of 80 different ASCs.
Wow.
Now, when I look at these, I understand the historical provenance, but I also understand the significance of what this ended up doing. Librarians at the time also were very aware of the literature available to the people of the day, but things that we now almost include in our own language, such as euphemisms, such as "a tree grows in Brooklyn," was an actual book. But at that time, it was a very unknown book and a very unknown author. That was the first book they printed into an ASE. And that's how him and many, many other authors became very, very popular, was because they were getting into the hands, they were being read. And when those soldiers came home, those stories became a part of their experience over there. And I say over there intentionally because there were ways we described wars even through words, because World War I, it was over there. World War II, I can't remember that one off the top of my head. But anyways, not to get too sidetracked on that. But we have somebody such as Robert Heinlein. Robert Heinlein was a World War II engineer. He was an aircraft engineer, and he served with a combat unit. And he read these books. When he came out of the war, he started writing books. He did write westerns such as Have Six Guns Will Travel, but he also would write sci-fi, where he had one book called Have Spacesuit Will Travel. Some of his books, right? Some of his books were turned into shows and ultimately into movies. What we now know as Spaceship Troopers was originally an idea with him. He's the one that came up with that. He's the one that wrote the book on it. Now, one of my favorites, and I know I've covered this before long ago when I was covering my top 3 of things. is my favorite radio drama. One of my favorites is Between Planets by Robert Heinlein. And I really enjoyed how he did things. He didn't try to imagine things so far in the future that it wouldn't have any significance to the people reading it during his time. He had stories that really put the heart of the average reader then on display. So, for example, Between Planets starts with a boy riding his mount through the desert. But then you realize this isn't just any mount. It's not a horse. It's a type of lizard. So he had an imagination to some degree. And then he had special saddles that were able to help them. The kid gets thrown from his mount, and instead of having his laser gun to be able to kill a snake, he has to use a good old whip and the help of his trusty steed that helped take out that snake. And now I'm questioning whether or not it was actually a lizard. I'm pretty sure it was. I might be mistaken. It's been a while since I've listened to it. Oh, no. But suffice it to say, these people were using what they had to create these stories. One storyteller, a lot like that, he created a story. Oh, man. I'm blanking. It was a story about a guy named Carter who went to Mars.
Oh,
Now,
yes.
we've actually got a recent movie. It was a complete bombshell at the theater, but I personally enjoy it.
I do too. My wife did not enjoy it at all, but I liked it. John Carter.
Yes, John Carter. And he uses the technology of the time to say, well, these guys, John Carter was telegraphed to Mars. So we've got things happening in World War II where people are being introduced to more ideas about storytelling and what it can do. And more simply, what it can do is it can provide a place for someone to go, especially when they're sitting in a trench being shot at with the threat of being killed, and engage their imagination, engage their soul, engage their spirit in a way that's going to bring them life in a whole new way and be able to look at life in different ways. Now, we might have the quintessential story where these days where the dwarf is hanging out in his smithy and he's making stuff. Well, we go back hundreds of years. Dwarf was also considered a trickster.
Wow.
He was taking things and he was causing some mayhem to some degree. And they were even linked with even the term itself is even linked with mental diseases of humans.
Oh,
So
wow.
there were some very interesting ways about how dwarves were perceived then to what they're perceived now. And World War II became that incredible catalyst that ended up transferring these things from being regional, from belonging to specific cultures, to specific histories, to becoming an artifact of mankind. And I say that intentionally because these artifacts of mankind are they're going to continue to proliferate, almost like tribbles from Star Trek. It's going to come at a rapid pace, and it's becoming even more of a rapid pace these days due to self-publishing and the internet in general, that people are being able to be giving a voice of sharing their idea, what they see dwarves doing, what they see elves doing, so on and so forth. So whether George McDonald knew it or not, what he took and used in a very supernatural way of even conveying some amazing scriptural, spiritual, and just plain truths in his time has since been carried into places where people have taken on dwarvish identities. There's dwarvish metal. There's actually a band that I know of who will dress up as dwarves. They'll go out on a stage and they will sing. They will sing songs that are directly out of Tolkien or other fantasy authors, or they'll write their own songs that have very dwarvish grammar and tones, and very deep in the earth. Not to get too Tim Allen here, but but then there are those who will have an Elvish wedding. The entire ceremony will be in Elvish. There's a famous scene. I can't remember the name of the movie, but there's a famous scene where Steve Zahn walks into this house. I think it was Daddy Daycare. Yeah, it was Daddy Daycare, I think. And Eddie Murphy's standing there with one other guy. I can't remember who it was. And this kid runs up, and Eddie has had a problem with this kid because he's talking, but it sounds like gibberish. But when Steve Zahn steps in the door, he's listening to this kid. He goes, ah. And he starts talking back to him in what perceivably is gibberish. But Zahn and Eddie and this guy are just standing there just completely baffled. Wait a minute, you actually understand this kid? Yeah, I understand him. He's talking in Klingon.
Oh, wow.
So, almost as a mother tongue, this toddler was running around talking to people in Klingon.
Wow.
Now, while that's still in the fictional realm of movie, there are actual communities out there who have taken on the nuances, the identities, the sense of self of characters from folklore and science fiction and fantasy. You have communities that are Elvish. You have communities that are Vulcan. You have communities that are hobbits, and so on and so forth. And not to mention when you get into these conventions and the myriad of divergencies that come into that realm. But I would say that fantasy and science fiction has aged in such a way that it's even taken a much more prominent role in people's lives. And it's becoming more and more of a medium to be able to connect in ways that get people where they're at. Now, not to say that it wasn't that way before. Story was a very big deal.
Sure.
Centuries ago. And it was used in very significant and meaningful ways. And in some cases, there were story keepers that would actually keep the folklore of the people and would use it almost in a spiritual way, in a religious sense, that we're going to sit down, you're going to hear these stories, we're going to talk about these stories, and these stories are going to help you become who you are. So the fact that people today are doing what some people would say are extreme has actually been the norm for thousands of years. So I'd like to end this episode with a story.
Excellent.
If that's okay. This is a modern story. Okay. This is a modern story, and it includes me. At one time in my plethora of careers, I worked at a elementary school. I was the only male in a teaching position. Now, I was not a full-fledged teacher. I was what was known as a paraprofessional, and I worked specifically with special ed kids, special needs kids.
Yes.
And it was a life-changing event of just not just what I'm about to tell you about, but just even working with these kids. They're some amazing kids. And some of the simple understandings of life that some of these kids helped me appreciate, I'll forever live with. There was this young boy who I did not work with. He actually had a dedicated teacher. She would spend all day with him. And as I've later learned, they actually had a dedicated classroom space for him downstairs that they would spend the majority of the day in. But when I would see him, it was usually being taken into a special room at the school that would allow him to just do what he was trying to do, which was either biting, kicking, pulling out hair, and being generally disruptive because he didn't want to do what he was being told or whatever the case may be. He had some problems. And I would see him go into this room multiple times in a day. Well, one day his teacher comes up to me and says, "Hey, I've got a meeting I have to be at. It's a luncheon meeting. It's going to be about 1 hour. I've got to go to this. I've asked everyone else. I wasn't about to ask you first because apparently men in that setting, to emphasize that, the first day of the job, I was walking through the hallway. A woman approaches me, says, "I'm head of security. What do you think you're doing back here?"
Oh my goodness.
And I didn't have my badge yet to prove I was on staff, but I told her who I was, and she says, "I don't believe you. Let's go." Took me to the office, and it was in the process of calling the police when the principal came out and says, "What are you doing? He needs to go to work." So principal had to step in. So unfortunately, there was a general animosity, not just towards anybody that who was not known coming back there, but even towards men, which I'm not going to go into right now. But this teacher made a point of saying, "I wasn't planning to come to you, but I have no choice. Will you help me?" So I said, "Yes, I'll help you." So we go downstairs to this classroom, and Benjamin's sitting, and this young man's name, I'm going to say his name. His name is Benjamin. He was known as Ben. He was sitting at his desk. The desk was against a wall. There were posters all around the room, and there were a few things that made it feel more classroomy, but you could really see how much of the room was being used for storage and the ambiance that created. So he's sitting there, and she points out some pages that are on the desk, and she says, "So this is some homework that he has to do, and I don't expect you to get through them, but if you do, great. Here they are. It's 4 pages, front and back. Groovy." So she takes off. So Benjamin's sitting there, and I sit down opposite him, and we're sizing each other up, right? We're looking at each other, going, "Okay, who are you, and what are you going to offer me?" Well, Benjamin would carry with him a stuffed dinosaur, and he had that dinosaur underneath his arm. And right next to him on the wall was more of pictures of dinosaurs on a poster. And so I just asked the very simple question, which you ask a simple question of a child, boom, they're gone. "You like dinosaurs?" Oh, the response I got from that kid, which was fun. But then I asked him, "Do you like dragons?" Oh, you thought I asked the Mona Lisa question of them all. He just, he went bananas about dragons. So I had this crazy idea of going, "Hey, how about I tell you a story of this kid who went with his cousins through a picture and turns into a dragon?" He says, "Oh, yeah. He's like, "Okay, groovy." So I start telling the story, and as I'm telling it, I get an idea. So I get to a point in the story where I create a cliffhanger, and I ask him, "Do you want to hear more?" He goes, "Yes, I do." "Okay, how about you do that page right there, that side of that page, and then I'll tell you more." Okay. So we take the time, and he zips through that page, and he gets everything done. I'm not helping him one bit, except maybe just answering 1 or 2 questions. He says, "Okay, I'm done. Can we go on?" "Okay, yeah. So we continue the story. By the time the hour's over, the teacher comes back, and she says, "Well, did you get anything done?" I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, he got all 4 pages done, both front and back." "No, he didn't. You did that." No, I didn't." And she grabs the principal, head of security again, and the vice principal. They come downstairs. They pull me out in the hallway. They keep Benjamin in there, and they're talking to us separately, like the average policeman might, saying, "Okay, as long as we can get the same story from both of them, we might know that they're telling the truth," sort of thing.
Oh my goodness.
By the time all is said and done, the principal is looking at me and saying, "Hey, would you be willing to take over Benjamin and his teaching for the rest of the school year?" This is April. Okay. It's the beginning of April. School year is going to end at the end of May.
Yeah.
And I'm looking at his teacher, and I'm saying, "Oh, I don't want to get in her way." And she goes, "You'd be doing me a favor." It gets just one look at her, and you just felt sorry for her. She just looked so exhausted and so tired. You just, "Oh, I'm so sorry that you've been through this, but you know what? Let's take the load off." So I said yes. And I've already connected with him. We've had fun with dragons. So one of the first things we did, we went up to the school library and we grabbed the book. The
Hmm.
Voyages of the Dawn Treader, part of the Chronicles of Narnia series by C.S. Lewis. And we read that book cover to cover. We also got homework done. Now, I am not saying this is because of me. I'm
Sure.
saying it's because Benjamin was finally finding a way to want to come to school, but more than that, even do his schoolwork. He managed to do the bare minimum required for an entire year in those few short weeks I was with him.
Hmm.
That meant a great deal to me. Yes, it really did. But more
Mhm.
because I'm seeing him being able to function in a way that he's able to learn, he's able to enjoy it, and he's able to prosper in this. So we end up on the blacktop, which was normally called for the playground. It was normally referred to
Sure.
as the playground. And most days when we'd go out to the playground, he would go play with kids, and then the kids would tell him, "No, go away, leave me alone." And then he'd come
Hmm.
back and sit next to me. And then he might venture out again bravely, courageously to try to play some more. And then the kids would play, and then they'd tell him to go away. But this day, he was sitting next to me, and he was very contemplative. And I looked at him and I said, "Something on your mind?" He goes, "Well, yeah, actually, there is." And he asked me the question, "You said when we read the book that Aslan said he was known by another name in Lucy's world." He said, "Now, if Lucy's from our world, then that means Aslan has a name here in our world." Now, before I started the job, I talked with a family member of mine who was in elementary school teaching for over 30 years. And one of the things she stressed to me was proselytizing. In other words,
Mm.
keep your mouth shut.
Yeah.
Sadly and unfortunately, keep your mouth shut because you can get in a lot of trouble for doing that. So I'm sitting there and he's asking me a very direct question. It is the second day to the last day of school. And I happen to know I'm not going to be returning next school year. So I'm going to step out and say, yes, I do know that name. Benjamin, from that point on, was asking all the questions and some very pointed questions at that, to the point where when we got done, he's sitting there and he asked me one final question. Sorry. I'll admit this story always tears me up because it's just, oh, wow.
It's a great
He asked
story.
me, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Marshall, will Jesus be my friend?
Mm.
I said, oh, Benjamin, he so wants to be your friend. And then he asked me the question, well, how do I make Jesus my friend? So I walked him through what it means to believe in Jesus. We even said a very simple prayer. We had a ball the next day, last day of school. We're doing games that the school had done, and I'm just getting to sit back and just appreciate just how far Benjamin's come. And then we part. Story doesn't end there though. A few weeks later, I'm walking through a grocery store and I hear my name being yelled out, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Marshall. And before I could look up or even look down for this matter, I get hit right in the middle. Oh boy, do I get hit. And I feel arms go around me and they're hugging me tight. And I look down, oh, hey, Benjamin, how you doing, buddy? And a woman comes up behind him, obviously his mother. She was in tears and she says, are you Mr. Marshall? I said, yes. She says, we had given up all hope. We had prayed the prayers. We'd made the effort that he would at least get into the Bible. We prayed the prayers that he would change, that he'd find a way to change. Nothing was working. You are an answer to prayer. And I'd say, well, thank you, but this is all God's doing. God's the one doing all of this. We just happen to be the tools in his hand. And it meant a lot to hear that even from his parents' point of view, that things had changed and continued to change and be the better. But what
Absolutely.
I noticed is that Benjamin's hands were not empty. And she says, we cannot go out of the house without him insisting to take a copy of The Voyage of the Dawn Treader in one hand and a Bible in the other. Because one of the last things I said to him was, you wanting to get to know your friend Jesus? Get yourself a Bible and start reading. And she says, we can't, and his mother tells me, we can't get him to go to bed at night without reading a chapter out of each book. Story ages well, and story can change lives.
Very good. Thank you for sharing that story. Always love to hear
You're
that
welcome.
one.
Yeah, you like that one, don't you?
I love that story. That story is a great example of how story ages.
Yes, it sure does. And I look forward to meeting Benjamin on the other side and hearing how he helped age the stories even more, about sharing them with his friends and his children and so forth.
Well, very good. Thank you for this episode. Thank you, listeners, for joining us. We will be back with the next one. And until then, happy reading and happy listening.